Housing costs are rising everywhere, and states across the country are scrambling for solutions. Whether it's zoning reform, permitting overhaul, or new approaches to affordability, one thing is clear: the old playbook isn't working. And California's newest move, SB 79, is one of the boldest experiments yet. To help us unpack what this bill means, I'm joined by Ben Metcalf, Managing Director of the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley. Ben is one of the most respected voices in the field, having worked across every corner of the housing system. He began his career as a developer, helped shape federal housing policy at HUD under the Obama administration, and later led California's Department of Housing and Community Development. Today at Turner, he's helping cities and states rethink what effective housing policy and innovation looks like in a high-cost, high-demand era. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. So, for listeners across the country, can you start by describing what the Turner Center is and how it approaches housing policy? I feel like it's this really cool incubator, but also think tank that's attached to UC Berkeley. And can you talk about the role it plays in helping cities, states, and the federal government respond to housing?
So the Turner Center we're a research center based out of the University of California, Berkeley. And we were founded probably 10 years ago with a mission to try and do research that would be actionable and translatable for policy context and practice context. So we do a lot of work out in the world trying to get a sense of what the issues are that are percolating. A number of folks at Turner come from non-traditional academic background. So I started my career as a developer. I worked in government for a while. Two of my other colleagues at Turner also started in practice. Our folks have spent time outside of academia and really value the sort of networks that we have. So those relationships help inform the projects that we take on so that we're picking work to do that's timely, topical, and relevant. And then we really try and get stuff out quickly. So in a few months, 6 months maybe, so that we can intersect with a window of opportunity. And then I'd say the other thing that is interesting about Turner is we really try and have a lot of intentionality. The goal is not just to write a research brief, but the goal is really to have impact in the world. So that means that we will do work that is rigorous, objective, and to the highest standards. But when we actually go to release it and share what we've learned, we're really trying to do that through and with a larger network of people in the community or in practice. So we are sort of thinking strategically about how we can disseminate our findings. We're partnering with organizations that can take our research and run it down the field and get in there and meet with congressmen or legislators in ways that we won't or couldn't.
I've been a huge fan of your work and the center's work for a long time because you're sort of the preeminent voice on housing policy. And the national conversation around housing has really been highlighted in the last couple of years, and especially in this last election cycle. And I'm curious, what are some of the more recent pieces of research and work that the center is putting out, especially around housing innovation, that can help solve the national housing crisis?
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges that we face in the sort of mandate that we've taken on as a center focused on housing innovation is that we try and cover the full gamut. So not only are we doing work that may touch on issues of sort of zoning and deregulation to help spur market rate supply, but on another day, we might be focusing on how can we better bring the healthcare system and healthcare resources to bear to support the needs of formerly homeless folks who are, trying to get off the street and into permanent housing, right? So like we sort of cover the full spectrum in terms of the topics we take on. We want to remain open to the idea that the housing system that we live in right now is so flawed that we may not be able to get there for incremental fixes or policy shifts. We really also need to be open to sort of wholly new practices and ideas of ways that we can get affordable housing created. And so a few years ago, one of the things that we did, which has been very successful, is we spun off a nonprofit organization called Turner Labs, which has been anchoring an accelerator program. It's a cohort-based annual program. We have an invitation to entrepreneurs, innovators, founders with a new idea coming up from the nonprofit or for-profit sector. Every year, we'll get 150 applications in and then diligence them down to get to a cohort of really exciting founders and companies, maybe 6 or 8 or 9 companies that we work with really closely over 6 months to really try and help them figure out how to scale and have rapid impact in the field. So like for me, that's a great example of like not only are we trying to do research on what's out there, but we're also recognizing that sometimes the things that we want to research aren't there yet. And we have to help them grow in order to get them to a place where we can then look critically at them and think about them for policy lessons and practice lessons.
Well, that's a nice reflection of sort of the group of experts that you've congregated at the center from developers and past policymakers. And I think most people, when they consider what the housing challenges are, look to government. But legislative solutions are only part of the battle. Can you talk about how these entrepreneurs, the development community, and policymakers have to work together to make impact here?
Yeah, I think the most obvious example of that is that we've actually seen over the last few years in places like California, the tremendous spate of zoning reforms, right? So, like, I think a lot of folks early on diagnosed a very obvious problem, which is many of the best buildable sites have been downzoned and are effectively very difficult to build on because of all kinds of process requirements that local governments have built in a generation or so of often very anti-development, sort of NIMBY kinds of sentiments that have emerged over time. And so when you look objectively, you might say, well, hey, actually, we've done great work now from a policy basis to really open up a lot of zoned parcels, zoned lots. And yet you don't see the building boom coming out of that deregulatory effort right away. A big part of that, obviously, is just cost. And some of the components of what makes it really expensive to build new housing do tie back to policy issues. And maybe you can say, well, there's issues of tariffs, there's issues of labor supply, immigration policy. There's issues of jurisdictions that are exacting larger and larger fees and property taxes. You could talk about the ways in which the building code, sort of the technical specs that we regulate builders to ensure health and safety and seismic and fire, all of those have gotten much more intense. So indeed, the reason why the cost is very high is because of a lot of policies that we put in place. And yet there's another critique that the building industry has just not been a place where there's been much innovation. And in fact, if you look at residential construction over the last 50 years, you'll see productivity measured in a number of different ways has basically just flatlined. Like the number of hours that it takes to build a building is basically the same today as it was in the late 1900s. And that's crazy, right? I mean, every other sector, whether it's pharmaceuticals, cars, phones, anything, when you look at that sort of productivity line, it just goes up and up, right? We've been able to figure out how to do automation. We've been able to fix supply chains. But really, when you watch somebody build a house today, maybe they have a nail gun instead of a hammer, but that's kind of it for the most part. And so I think that is a really good example of where it's not just a policy response. We also need to figure out how to push the state of practice, get home builders, developers to really start embracing some of the new methods that are out there that have been used for a long time now. It's an industry and a sector that's been pretty resistant to onboarding these kinds of efficiency, new technologies, new ways of working. And I think we can play a role, in helping spur the industry to take on a little bit more risk in this area and try and get outside of its comfort zone.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got kind of thinking of multiple different faucets and you're sort of turning on these different ones to bring resources to the sector. So it seems like this faucet of deregulation has been turned up, especially in hard to build places like California. And I was hoping you could
Yeah.
talk a little bit about what that faucet has sort of done in the last couple years, especially as we
Yeah,
think about AB
exactly.
130.
No, first of all, the zoning piece is fundamental and foundational. If you're not allowed to build, there's no point of trying to increase your productivity or efficiency, because if the zoning doesn't allow you to build a building, then you're not going to build a building. So it is an obvious and very powerful first step. What's super interesting about this moment is that the states that have been most active in this kind of housing work are not all blue. In fact, there probably is as many sort of red states as blue states. Montana, Utah, Arizona, Texas, Florida even have been doing really exciting and interesting work to try and spur more housing and different kinds of housing. I think part of the reason California is so interesting is, number one, it was as bad as any other state in the country in terms of the affordability challenges, but also in terms of layering on process requirements, regulatory restrictions, the downzoning that we talked about. And so in some sense, California has been ground zero for sort of how do we think about strategically unwinding some of this stuff to really unlock the housing that we need. If you basically track from 2016 to 2025 forwards, 9 years now, the state has generated hundreds of bills on housing that have been signed by the governor, doing a whole range of things. So I think, to the question, first of all, what have we done that's actually worked? Probably the biggest historic example of this has been the accessory dwelling unit legislation that's been passed over the last few years that has really opened up the ability of homeowners anywhere in California to be able to add at least one, sometimes two new units to their homes, essentially as of right. And as a sort of state law, state mandate, it means that homeowners get to go to their local planning and building departments, and those planning and building departments basically can't say no, so long as what the homeowner is proposing is in line with the state legislation and still satisfies, basic health and safety issues. And so, that's a good example of like, hey, does all this policy work and have an impact? Actually, you can look at the numbers now on ADUs, and you can see that in 2016, there were literally just a few hundred ADUs a year that were getting permitted in the state of California. Fast forward to 2023, 2024, we now have in the range of 25,000 or 30,000 new ADUs that are getting
Wow.
permitted. So ADUs have become not the majority of new homes in California by any measure, but like a quarter of all newly permitted homes maybe now. I think that's why this is an exciting moment, because you can see in a couple of the things that have happened the ability for the state to have real transformative impact.
Well, that's exciting. I'm trying to gauge how ADUs can augment and bring in additional value for the homeowners, but also create new units for others. And I'm trying to juxtapose that with, I know Minneapolis outlawed single family zoning a few years ago, and that's more geared towards infill development, new development. What is this seesaw effect between looking at housing that's already been built, so this ADU policy and how that augments existing housing, and new housing and the opportunity to increase density with new housing?
I mean, part of the problem in California, not unlike Minneapolis, is that when you try and do state reforms or mandates that are targeted towards new supply, and particularly new supply of large subdivisions or apartment buildings, the politics get much more complicated.
Hmm.
There have been hundreds of bills that California has passed. There are quite a few that have tried to spur sort of the broader housing industry. But a lot of those have had relatively limited impact because over the last decade, many of them have come with a bunch of strings attached.
Hmm.
So maybe they've only applied to certain infill sites. Maybe they've had requirements that builders have set aside, a bunch of them for low income residents. Many of them require, full construction or union labor be used. Basically, California's effort to try to do this well is trying to basically say, well, if we're going to make a reform, let's actually try and align it along many different policy wins. Like,
Hmm.
if we're going to unlock housing, great. Let's help this align with our climate goals. Let's help this align with our affordability goals. Let's help this spur worker wages. ADUs was actually different because ADUs sort of went under the radar a little bit and is not a space that makes sense for affordable housing. It's not a place where the unions are engaged. It's already intrinsically infill, right? So like that's a good example where you didn't have a lot of the other requirements on it. And so it was very successful.
Well, recently, Governor Gavin Newsom signed SB 79, which is specifically focused on transit oriented development and unlocking the density around areas that have high transit resources. And when I was reading through this, that tension that you're sort of speaking to between state policy and local government dynamics seems to come into play here. And I was wondering if you could just introduce SB 79, and can you speak about this dynamic between the state and the localities and the tension there?
Yeah, so this is exactly the challenge that we've had in past years is that when there have been efforts to do sort of broad and comprehensive upzoning, the politics have gotten quite complicated because folks have voiced all kinds of really reasonable concerns. Well, if we're going to create this notional windfall to landowners because they can build more, shouldn't we ask more of them in terms of affordability, in terms of union wages? Aren't we worried about unintended consequences because we hadn't gone through a thoughtful planning process at the local level? I think a lot of folks invoked, hey, isn't this sort of a reminiscent of the battle days of urban renewal or freeway expansion or public housing where the government just came in and did dramatic things in ways that we came to regret decades later. All to say, Wiener's earlier attempts at doing very substantial, very broad, comprehensive upzoning sort of failed because the politics were just too hard to navigate and the constituency groups were very, very strongly opposed. In this latest iteration, I think two things are different, right? One is I think there's a higher and higher level of intensity and desire to be able to put big things on the table. And so I think that has given the leadership in the legislature, the governor and others a little bit more leeway to push a little bit harder than they did a couple of 2, 3, 4 years ago in previous iterations. The second thing is that the bill SB 79, which is a very significant upzoning, is limited, and is limited in a couple of key ways. One is that it only applies to sites that are proximate to the highest frequency transit. So, literally, it's like light rail, the BARTs, the LA metros, real bus rapid transit with dedicated stops and dedicated lanes and that kind of stuff. In fact, the legislation explicitly just said we're only even talking about, I think it's like 8 counties or something in California. And I think that was helpful politically, but also it's more compelling as a policy motivation because all of that major transit infrastructure only exists ultimately because of state investment, right? Like
Yes.
coming out of COVID too, we see this very clearly. Like transit systems up and down the country are profoundly at risk. Like they're almost all running under budget. And we don't want these rail systems that we've invested billions of dollars in to go under. We need the ridership to support them. And so this is basically saying like, hey, the area around these regional transit stops should not be a matter of local control because it isn't, because the people who use these systems are going to be supporting a regional transit infrastructure system. And if we want the transit infrastructure to succeed, we need to make those investments there. So near high performing transit, you can do 8 stories or 9 stories, 6 stories, and you can do it all by right, which means that basically as long as you can, sort of like the ADUs, as long as
Hmm.
you can show that the building that you want to propose conforms to the objective design standards that the city has and fits within the state law. Not only can they not say no, but there's like very few grounds even for citizens to sue or litigate because it is sort of prima facie conforming to state law. There is a very small affordability component, but it's actually very modest relative to past legislation. It is a labor standard, but it only applies for the highest buildings that are going to be steel and concrete anyway. So it did thread the needle, I think, in many ways to result in a bill that we think actually will probably be one of the more impactful bills that we've seen come out of the legislature in California in years.
I like how you're framing it up that transit is a state investment, and therefore there should be a say from the state and how that investment is able to succeed. Transit oriented development isn't just about state versus local investments, it's also this transportation land use convergence. Why is this the place you'd want to invest in for housing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of reasons. So the first is the one that I mentioned already, which is like, hey, if we want our transit systems to continue to be able to operate, we need to give them riders. And actually, the best way to give them riders is to have people living proximate to them. You're never going to build enough parking lots around your transit stations to be able to boost your. You really just need people living next to them. The second is that transit systems don't exist in a vacuum, right? That they tend to actually be located in communities that already have amenities and resources. In fact, there's been a lot of good research, including some that Turner has worked on over the last year, that shows if one of the goals that we have as a society is to try and minimize the amount of miles that people are traveling in vehicles, right? Like if we all agree that it's generally not great to spend hours in a car, it's not good for the climate, it's a big expense for households. There's actually great work that shows the more time you spend commuting, the less time you spend with your children. Generally, if we can get people out of their cars, it's really good on a bunch of different levels. Well, it turns out that the sort of core commute function, which you go from your house to the office, is actually not the major contributor to the use of cars, right? The major contributor is everything else. Dropping your kids off at school, getting your groceries, going to meet your friends, all that kind of stuff. What's cool about transit systems is not only that they provide transit to job centers, but that usually the stops are located in areas that are already pretty densely populated with a variety of amenities and a mix of amenities. And so what you're really doing is you're unlocking density in the kind of communities where people are going to be able to get many of their basic needs fulfilled without having to resort to a car. And SB 79 is like not just taking advantage of that, but it's also like furthering that because the bill
Mhm.
does allow, some non-residential components to be included in these buildings. So you can also imagine many of these buildings are not just housing, but are coming up with retail at the ground floor as well. Part of the problem with, trying to spur intense housing development in single family neighborhoods is not just the zoning, it's actually what's called the parcelization.
Hmm.
And so to build large buildings, you actually also need large lots to build them on. If you go into a single family zone neighborhood and you say, okay, we've changed the law and now you can build multifamily apartment buildings in this community, nobody's going to build any multifamily apartment buildings because you can't fit a multifamily apartment building on an individual single family lot. And the process of trying to acquire a block and then build on that by getting 30 different homeowners to each individually agree is a nightmare. And so what you find at these transit hubs is not only that you now have favorable zoning, that you also have a favorable sort of amenity package, but that you also have large lots that are just facilitative and conducive to building big buildings.
Hmm. So I want to go to back to this city versus state tension. And I'm curious, this law isn't fully implemented until 2030. And there seems to be an alternative plan, the Eckhouse plans, that these cities can implement to distribute this density to other places. Can you sort of talk through what that mechanism is and if you think it'll be successful, and where would you see this playing out?
Yeah, so I think it was a super interesting place for the bill authors to land on this because there is this tension between, does the state just prescriptively mandate what you can do at the local level, or does the state sort of tell jurisdictions the outcome that it wants and asks them to figure out how to get there? And in fact, California has sort of a history of doing both. This one, SB 79, sort of is a funky little hybrid that actually tries to get the best of both, I think, which is to say, it does prescriptively hand down a zoning regime for these subject lots. It says to cities in a sort of a little dose of humility, like, we probably don't actually know at Sacramento what's best for the area around your transit hub. And in fact, the law does things like if you already have done a recent significant TOD upzoning plan, then this doesn't apply right away. But the thing that you're referring to, sometimes known as ECHOUS plans, basically gives cities the option to reallocate the zoning within the subject area so that if they have a different way to achieve the same outcome. So, the basic conceit is that you can actually theoretically sort of count up the amount of upzoning that the state bill has effectuated. Like literally,
Mm.
you could do the math. You could say on this parcel, it used to only allow 10 units, but now it's going to allow 45. And so that increment, that 35, is sort of your upzoning potential. And what the bill says is that you can actually take that 35 incremental extra upzoning off of the lot that you don't want to get upzoned, but you have to put it somewhere else, still in the same proximate area of the transit station. So it allows jurisdictions to go through a sort of a process of reallocating that density in a way that works better with their local needs. But a couple things. One is it does put the gun to the city's heads in the sense that it's like, if you don't do that, the state default density is control. And it does require the cities to do that rezoning process through their traditional means and methods, which then would involve participatory processes and community input and engagement, which will be a longer process. In fact, I think most people that I'm talking to are not anticipating that a lot of these replanning efforts will happen right away.
Mm.
Instead, they'll probably get folded into longer term rezoning efforts as part of what's called the seventh cycle of the housing element process here in California, which is an every 8-year process that cities always go through to update all of their zoning. For many cities, that's going to be coming up in 2 or 3 years. So the expectation is the SB 79 laws will probably control for the time being, but then
Mhm.
cities will sort of like onboard this mandate back into their sort of normal course of business while
Mm.
still keeping net the amount of upzoning constant.
Okay, so if I'm a developer and I identify a site within the SB 79 half mile area of a transit rich locale, and I by right have an opportunity to build 9 stories here, do I have to worry about the Yuck House plans? Do I have to worry about the seventh cycle of the housing element? Or by right, I can go ahead and get my plans approved for my 8, 9 story building and move forward?
Yeah, my understanding is the risk would be that you don't file your application to the city quickly enough, right? My understanding is as long as you just file your application, you get it approved through the ministerial process, then that entitlement is binding regardless of what zoning changes come after it. And I think the reality of these ECHOUS plans is that they are going to take many, many months to effectuate. To the extent that cities are moving to enact these plans, developers will have visibility that these processes are starting, and they will probably at the same time say, okay,
Hmm.
this new plan won't work to the benefit of the site that I control, so I'm going to submit my application for the site today and try and get it fully processed before the council acts on the updated plan months from now.
Okay. And you haven't seen in the, I think it's been 6 weeks since Governor Gavin Newsom signed this bill, any percolating legal actions against the state for such bill?
I haven't.
Okay.
I know there's some chatter that it might emerge. I know, there's been a lot of concern. For example, Los Angeles, in Mayor Bass and others were very strongly opposed to this. So I have no doubt that there will probably be some kind of litigation that does emerge. I have no doubt that there will probably be some kind of push legislatively to do some cleanup or technical fixes to try and change some stuff. There may be other issues that are discovered with the bill as it moves farther along. I mean, this was a complicated bill, and complicated bills often don't get it right the first time out.
Hmm.
So we may see some evolution on this, but I don't really think the core principle is going to be overturned. I don't think the courts are going to move to toss this thing out in its entirety. I certainly don't think the legislature is going to move to pull it back. So I think for the most part, most developers are going to be able to move forward on most of these sites.
I want listeners to understand that this isn't the first time a state has rolled out a policy like this. Massachusetts, Washington all have TOD upzoning policies. And I was hoping, Ben, you could sort of speak to those states and how a TOD housing policy has been successful or where it's faltered that Californians should be aware of.
So I guess I would say that you're absolutely right. Like Massachusetts, the MBTA policy, Washington, there are a couple of other states that have done TOD legislation. Most of the biggest TOD legislation that I've seen has been fairly recent. I actually think across the country, we're in a space where everybody is sort of looking at these different models and methods and sort of seeing what's been working and what's not, what's unlocking more housing and what's not. I think the through line is this one we talked about earlier, which is that the state has a more powerful nexus to intervene because of the infrastructure and transit investments that has already been made. B, I would also say that TOD is politically, in some ways, actually just easier than
Mm.
like upzoning residential neighborhoods. There's actually been a lot of good polling data on this that single family homeowners in particular are very resistant to change. They're very resistant to multifamily buildings. I think there are the big upzonings that we've seen that have applied to single family neighborhoods, with the exception of California's ADU law, have generally not gone forward because they've been strong. They've triggered resistance, political recalls of elected officials, and so on and so forth. But TOD areas tend not to have as strong a political constituency
Hmm.
that opposes them as these other broader zoning reform measures, which I think is probably helpful across the board. Again, whether you're in a red or blue or somewhere else state, that makes me think that these TOD upzonings are probably going to be stickier. They're probably going to survive even any likely backlash that does emerge.
We talked about the faucets previously. So we just turned off the deregulatory policy faucet. And now I'm thinking, what are the other faucets that need to turn to make sure that the goals of SB 79 are realized? And how do cities and local agencies prepare for SB 79?
Yeah, I'm hearing from a lot of city planners just the sense of overwhelm that this SB 79 comes on top of, again, I mentioned the hundreds of state laws that have been passed the last few years, and they're having a hard time keeping up. They're in a very reactive position where developers will show up and give them a proposal, and the city planner will say, "Well, that's that doesn't work," and the developer will say, "Oh, yes, it is. Look at this bill that just got passed." So developers often are in the position of educating the city staff as to what they have to be approving, which is just not a great dynamic. So I do think we're at a moment where we do need to figure out a way to sort of build the capacity of cities. The SB 79 has a lot of requirements also for the state to continue to issue some clarifying guidance. The state hasn't yet hired anybody to do that. So all of that machinery of implementation and education is important for this bill, and particularly important because it comes on the heels of many other changes. Back to where we started the conversation and your foster analogy, I don't know that this on its own is going to be as hugely transformational and impactful as it will be unless we can also figure out how to fix a few other things. Concurrently in 2025, we did see some pretty significant CEQA relief, California Environmental Quality Act relief. Newsom signed into law a budget bill that included an exemption for CEQA from projects that are in infill areas. So I think turning down some of the CEQA litigation is going to help speed up housing, particularly in these infill areas that are less environmentally fraught than the greenfield locations are. And like the issue of cost and fees and taxes that are imposed is a real problem for California. California, because of Prop 13, cities have a very heavy reliance on new development as a way to get the money that they need to do things like invest in parklands, invest in transit, invest in affordable housing. We ask new developers to pay a very large fee. It can be $100,000 a door in impact fees just for the privilege of showing up. Cities don't have other good options to this. So it's a real quandary, but I think we have to figure out a way to sort of lower that cost. There's also a lot of energy right now on the building code front. So for all kinds of good reasons, we've made buildings very, very safe and durable and secure. The building standards that California requires of builders are among the most stringent in the world, literally. And that'll be great when the next earthquake hits for sure. But I think that the challenge is that the building code system is only ever a one-way ratchet. We've only ever made it more and more stringent. We've never really had a lens that's just tried to weigh the broader cost benefits of these improvements. It also increasingly I've become very frustrated with our code regime because it also seems like it's actually an inhibitor in many ways on innovation. It's actually preventing folks who are building, factories and doing panelized or kit parts or volumetric modules that will get deployed. Like it turns out that the code regime we built is pretty hostile to innovation. So I think there's a bunch of stuff there that could help with lowering the cost, but we need to do some work over the next year or two.
We're heading into the end of 2025. I would love for you to take your crystal ball and let us know from where you're sitting at the intersection of innovation and policy and development, what you foresee for 2026, not just in California, but across the national landscape as it pertains to housing.
We had an election just a couple weeks ago where we had a slate of candidates winning, whether it was Madami in New York or new governors in New Jersey. And I think there's been a lot of good commentary on this, which resonates to me, which is, the folks who won in all of those elections only won because they ran on platforms of affordability. That is very resonant for the electorate right now. Housing is the biggest household expense. It's also the component that has risen the most. And so I think when we talk about cost of living or talk about affordability more broadly, I think we're really talking about housing. And so I think elected officials across the board right now, particularly as they're gearing up for the midterm races next year, folks are sort of figuring out, okay, what does my affordability agenda look like? And really, what does my housing agenda look like? So I don't think this is an issue that's going to go away. No state is an island on its own. Any state's ability, any governor's ability to deliver on housing is substantially contingent on what's happening in DC. For the past year, we've seen two just massive headwinds that I think we still haven't quite seen how bad it's going to get or if there's going to be relief, but tariffs has been a huge driver on costs. Many tariffs have been applied to components of housing, whether that's appliances or Canadian lumber, and are directly driving up costs in ways that are causing feasibility problems for builders. This immigration policy of the federal government is also, just very, very bad. Obviously, it's an idea that you're going to deport folks who have been hardworking construction sector immigrants is going to cause a labor shortage. There are markets where 25% of the workforce in the construction sector is undocumented. So, I don't know how buildings get built if we don't have people to build them with, right? So those are big headwinds. On the tailwind side, though, there is an executive order sitting on the president's desk as we speak that's going to try and reduce a bunch of federal regulations. We don't know the content of that specifically, but everything I'm hearing is that a lot that's in there will be helpful from a housing supply perspective. There is a package of bills that came out of the Senate a couple weeks ago under the Road to Housing, which were all enacted in a bipartisan fashion and collectively represent the biggest set of housing reforms that Congress has moved on in the last couple decades. So, those are the big trends that I think will really shape the space that states and localities get to play in the next couple of years. One of the things that definitely also gives me some hope in this business I've been working in it for a few decades is the sort of excitement, younger folks who are coming up and looking at the mess housing system is and are not running away, but are coming at it with new energy and new ideas. I'm really excited also by some of the ways in which folks are organizing new entities like Abundance or like the EMB, or are actually thinking differently about organizations like environmental organizations or civic organizations that historically haven't been very focused on housing, but now are realizing, hey, this is a space where we need to have a point of view on it too. So I think that next generation is coming up with a very different set of perspectives on this that'll be very helpful to all of us to make progress.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going. So until next time, let's keep building better cities together.